Welcome back to the Wix Wiz. I'm Eitan, and this is kind of an emergency episode here on the channel. And it's about something that I hinted to in the recent blog post and live stream. This is something that I've been hearing chatter about for about 2 months so far from different sources at Wix, etc. And while I had been assured that it is a long time away until this process begins, today I wake up to this article in the documentation, which pretty much announces this change. So since this is like huge, this is a fundamental shift in the approach to development on Wix websites. And we kind of have to go with the flow and do what we can. And I'll talk a little bit about some possible pros and cons here and why I think Wix is possibly jumping the gun on this a little bit and releasing it a little faster without doing um, the proper preparation, which is, a little it's along the lines of the Wix approach to releasing updates, so it's not so surprising. But as developers on Wix, this can be a big shift that we should definitely talk about and learn about. Since this is really new, and I have heard some information about this before, but I haven't gotten a chance to really learn the implications yet and dive in. So I'm going to be approaching this as a read through. I'm just going to read through the update as it is and give kind of my 2 cents and try to understand it together with you. As someone who, again, this is brand new, so there's no way I could have known much about this in advance, let alone be an expert in it. But hopefully, together over the next 10, 20, 30 minutes, we'll be able to figure it out and understand what the implications for us are as developers and what next steps we need to take. So about Velo only APIs and the SDK. A little background, SDK is the Wix JavaScript SDK that's been used until now in mostly headless and Wix apps. They link to it over here. I'll just open it up so you can see what it looks like. So that's this over here, and I'm sure we'll be taking another look at it as we read through. So about the Velo-only APIs and SDKs, Wix is beginning to transition away from using Velo APIs. Let that sink in favor of the next generation Wix JavaScript SDK. During this transition period, you can choose to start using the SDK for website development and for app creation within blocks. While most Velo APIs have SDK equivalents, I think that that is an overstatement, honestly. Even though I'll be honest, I haven't used the SDK very much, but I think that this sounds like an overstatement to me. The reason being that Velo was built with websites in mind, with Wix websites in mind, whereas the SDK docs were built with applications in mind. So I think that we are going to encounter a lot of scenarios where the SDK doesn't really think till the end about what the implications are for websites versus apps, and we're going to find a lot of holes in the SDK. The ones listed in this section do not currently exist in the SDK. I highly doubt it's only the ones listed here. Just for reference, these 4 APIs. I will eat my hat if these are the only things that are not in the SDK. Just one thing that pops to mind that I don't think is in the SDK. Again, we can double check, but the whole concept of, let's say, $W, which is something that you'd only really use on a Wix website or in a Blocks app, and it isn't really relevant to the app world in general. I highly doubt that that is part of the SDK because it just wouldn't make much sense. So again, I want to come to this with an open mind, but I'll be completely honest that I think this is happening way too fast without a proper thought process. if you want to implement features that rely on the functionality of these Velo-only APIs when using the SDK, continue using the existing Velo APIs. So for the foreseeable future, we're going to live in a world where we essentially now have two full sets of documentation that we need to search through in order to find what we're looking for. Because again, even though they single out these four APIs over here, I don't think that's going to be the case. The APIs listed in this section will continue to function unchanged. Okay, so that means the APIs, I'm not sure if they're referring to the APIs in this section as in Velo only APIs or generally the Velo API reference. This means that you can't install NPM packages to use the APIs with the SDK. Instead, import and use them as described in this reference whenever necessary. So just so we understand, I mean, there are a few more articles here that we're going to read, but just so you understand, I'm going to assume that you have some familiarity at least with Velo. So the way Velo works, and again, we talked about this a bit in the last live stream. Let's go ahead and turn on dev mode. So let's just take, for example, Wix query. So here I am in dev mode. So if I wanted to run a query here using Velo as we know it, okay, awesome. This pop-up won't go away. Yeah, so if we want to write a Velo query as we know it, so we would just go ahead over here and we would import Wix data, just like that. Okay, we don't need to install any kind of NPM package or anything like that. And then over here in our onReady or another function, we can go ahead and, run a query. So we could say, let's say const query result equals to await Wix data dot query, etc., etc. Okay, and I'm ignoring the fact that it needs to be async and whatever. I'm just showing you the concept of imports. With the SDK, it works a little differently, and essentially you need to install NPM packages and import from those packages. So let's go ahead over here and let's see. So here we have the SDK. These are core modules. So here, first the documentation is split up very differently. So we have here backend modules, and here we have account level modules. Here we have front end modules. One interesting thing that I noticed is that Wix data, let's say, which is, let me take a look over here. So we have here Wix data inside the SDK. This is considered a backend module, even though on Wix websites you can use Wix data in the front end if the permissions match and whatnot in terms of the collections, but there's no reason to treat Wix data as backend module versus front-end module. It works in both places. So that's just some of the little inconsistencies and yeah, just things that I think we're going to be dealing with. So let's just take a look here at the data. So introduction. So in order to get this to work, let me see here. Let me go here, let's say so first of all, the whole syntax is different. So here, instead of running, let's say, wixdata.query, here in order to run a query, what we need to do is run something called items.query. Okay, so it looks a little different. Let me just scroll down here so you can see the syntax. So here it's called, here it's aggregate. So items.aggregate or items.query would be the query. If we go look here at the query. So items.query, I personally think that that's poor naming because you're querying a collection and not items. You're getting items, but okay. And if we go over here and we look, let's see, in terms of setup. So this is how the SDKs work. So first of all, for depending on what we're trying to do on the site, we might need to install several different packages. So if I'm using Wix data, then I would need to install the Wix data package. If I'm using something else, I need to install a different package. So potentially we're talking about a scenario here we have to install multiple different packages. This could have an upside because possibly having less packages on our site might help in terms of performance theoretically, but since the Velo APIs are still working side by side, I don't really see what advantage this poses at the moment. So just kind of a note about the future. So npm install, the syntax here is assuming that you're creating an application, so you're not inside of a Wix website, which is what these SDKs were created for. So in order to install this package inside of a Wix website, what we'll need to do is we'll go here to our code panel, and we'll look here for packages and apps, and we'll go to where we would typically install npm packages in Wix, and just go ahead and install npm package, and then we need to search for this. So it's as if it's an outside package. It's not something that, I mean, it's created by Wix, but this is like a general package manager. So we'd go ahead and install that over here. And then once the package is installed, then we can go ahead and do the imports. There we go. So it's installed, no README. Check out the documentation. And then we can go ahead and we can import like this. Okay, so just go ahead and copy. So the import will look like this instead. So import items from @wix /data. Okay, and it can't find my module, which is interesting. I think in the live stream we tested this out and it did work. So I think it's just a matter of Wix not yet having updated its linting or something. But basically then here, instead of what we have, const query result equals await, etc. So we'd have const query result, let's say SDK equals to await items dot query, and then the rest is pretty much the same. Okay, so this for this it might not seem like a huge change. I still think it's probably a little more complicated for, I mean, if you're a developer coming from outside Wix and you're used to npm and installing packages and stuff like that, then you probably don't feel like this was too complicated, which, to be fair. But if you're primarily a Wix dev and you've been kind of using Velo code to kind of do a little thing here or there, I do think this adds a level of complication that might make it harder for people to develop on Wix. Now, you may already be thinking like, what the heck? Like, why is this happening? What is the reasoning, etc. So I do have a little information into as some explanations that have been given to me as to why this is happening. I do want to hold off because we do have a few more articles to read, and I just want to see if there's any explanation about it inside of these articles. Because I think that is an important part of this whole transition. So if that's not explained correctly, then I feel it's kind of missing something here. So I want to just give them a chance to explain here in the official documentation. And if we don't see anything that explains it, then I'll try and give my 2 cents based on what I've heard from Wix. So let's go over here to transition to the SDK. And let's see. So this seems to be pretty much, this already seems to pretty much just repeat what we saw before about the transition to the SDK. I don't know if we mentioned this earlier, but the SDK already includes some functionality not available with Velo APIs. So essentially, what this means is that, I mean, the REST APIs were always kind of a step ahead of Velo API. So something would be released in REST, and SDK is essentially a wrapper for REST. And then I guess it would come to Velo APIs. That was kind of how APIs trickled down over time. But now it seems like there's a kind of a stopper on that. So things are updated in REST and SDK, and they're not going to be trickling down, or they haven't trickled down to Velo APIs. So that means that there are things in the SDK that aren't in the Velo APIs. I think this was always true to some extent, but this is going to become more and more true over time. So if you're trying to implement something and you can't find it in the Velo APIs, you're going to want to go ahead and look for that in the SDK. So here we go in terms of, okay, to learn how to migrate existing Velo code to SDK, see migrate from Velo to SDK. So we'll take a look at that in a moment. Let's see what's going on over here. Velo API reference restructure. The transition to the SDK is a gradual process. At this stage, not all Velo APIs have SDK equivalents, so we talked about this a bit already. The Velo API reference has been restructured to reflect this and now consists of the following sections. Velo-only APIs. I already expressed my opinion about this before. APIs, these Velo APIs already have corresponding SDK versions. If you want to use these functionality APIs, we recommend that you use their SDK equivalents. Okay? Events and service plugins. Most of these Velo APIs have SDK counterparts. However, the SDK counterparts don't currently support site development or app creation with blocks. If you want to use functionality of these APIs for these purposes, you should continue using the existing Velo APIs. Am I the only one that's confused? I don't know. This last part kind of threw me off. However, the SDK counterparts don't currently support site development or app creation with blocks. Okay. So basically, if you want to use events and service plugins, which are the SPIs, you're still using Velo APIs. So I don't know if that means that, like, if I'm implementing a service plugin inside the code files that belong to the service plugin, if I can only use Velo APIs, or there I can use SDK, or it just means that I can't use the SDK in general to implement these things at a higher level. In terms of events, what I understand this to mean is not Wix events, so not the Wix events business app, but the backend events, what happens inside the events.js. So for example, if we take a look here at, let's say, Wix ecom backend, and we take a look over here at, we should have some events here. So let's say current cart. Where are the events? Oh, sorry, they're in Wix ecom 2. No. Wix ecom backend. Where are those events? Why can't I find the events? Does that mean that, is that because of the change? 1 second, maybe that's because of the change. Oh, yes, okay. Okay, so this is pretty significant. So basically what they did is they extracted all of the events from the APIs and they moved them into this additional section. So if we go over here, that's why I couldn't find what I was looking for. But if we go over here to e-commerce, so here we have all the events. So we have, on something, on order created, on cart created, blah, 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 all that stuff that would happen in the events.js. So those don't happen in the SDK yet. So already we're creating a world where in order to implement features on a Wix website, you now have 2 full sets of documentation that you need to deal with. So you need to be hopping around between SDK and whatever's left in Velo and kind of mix and match and piece things together, which is always fun. Great. So now that we have we've understood that to some extent, one thing, so just some thoughts that are coming to mind here. Potential things that I think possibly also don't work in the SDK. For example, inside of Wix data, we have hooks. So I'm guessing that those hooks don't work. Oh, here, Wix data, hooks. So I'm not sure. I have a feeling that these hooks probably won't work in terms of the SDK because they have a unique file within Wix. And so just similar to, HTTP functions that have their own file, I just feel that that is something, yeah. I have a hard time imagining that the hooks can be implemented in any way using the SDK. Yeah. So just some more things that maybe they didn't think of so much, or I'm wrong, but I feel like there was, yeah, this was kind of rushed. This was kind of taken out of the oven, for the people who like it raw. Yeah, okay. So cool. Okay, so we read this, which was pretty much a repetition, but like a little more expanding over here. So let's take a look here about the migrate from Velo to SDK, which is probably something that we're all concerned about. I don't think that you need to start rushing to all your sites and changing things. From what I've heard from Wix, and we'll probably see this here in the documentation as well, everything will continue working as it has until this point. So all the Velo APIs that exist will continue to exist as they are and will not break. Again, they told me for a very long time, but they told me also this was going to be a very long time, so I don't really know anymore. But yeah, so just I don't think you have to go in a rush and go switch everything over, but it's more of like a future, just kind of like a deprecated API versus an API that's going to continue to be updated. Okay, so this okay, so Wix is beginning transition. Again, same introduction. You are encouraged to start using the SDK in all new and ongoing development projects. You may want to migrate existing code written using the Velo API to the SDK, since the current SDK closely mirrors the latest module versions in the Velo API. Migration is typically straightforward. I kind of read here between the lines that, oh, better to do it now because things are rather similar, so it'll be smooth, whereas in the future it'll be completely different, so you'll have a headache. But I'm not sure if that was what was intended. Okay, step one, identify what to migrate. At this stage in the transition from the Velo API to the SDK, not all Velo APIs have the SDK equivalents that can be used for site development or for app creation with blocks. For functionality that is not yet supported in the SDK, continue using Velo APIs alongside the SDK, so the things that we mentioned earlier. So events and those few packages that Wix identified and all the other things that Wix has not really identified yet, but probably also are not possible in the SDK. For functionality that isn't supported in the SDK, follow the steps below. To see what functionality is available in the SDK and what functionality is not yet available, see About Site Development. I'll open that in a new tab. Install packages. The SDK is available through public NPM packages, what I demonstrated earlier. Each module in the SDK has its own package. Determine which packages you need to install. Check the methods you use in the SDK reference to see which packages you need. Each module's introductory documentation specifies the package you need to install. Install the packages you need using the editor in the Wix CLI. One sec, I need to read it again. I zoned out. Okay, check the methods you need to use in the SDK, see which packages you need. Each module's introductory documentation specifies the package you need to install. Install the packages you need using the editor or the Wix CLI. Okay, the Wix CLI, okay, I got it now. The Wix CLI is what you'd be using if, let's say, your site is connected to GitHub. Actually, I didn't know this, but if your site is connected to GitHub, then I guess you can install NPM packages programmatically through the CLI versus doing it through the editor. So that's what they're probably referring to here with like 90% certainty. And using the editor is what I demonstrated earlier. Adjust import statements. As you need to import the SDK package instead of the Velo module, from a Velo module, you need to adjust your existing import statements. For example, to create a booking using Velo, you import bookings from Wix Bookings v2. To create a booking using the SDK, you import bookings from Wix Bookings. Okay, so this is pretty much what I demonstrated earlier, just with the queries, and here they're doing a demonstration with Wix Bookings. Step 4, check for differences. This is the fun part. In many cases, the SDK version of a method works exactly the same as the Velo version, and no further changes are necessary. I do not believe that. I'll say it straight out. I'm just going to call it as it is. Like, even in I know we didn't do it here, but when we did it in the live stream, if you want, you can circle back and take a look at that, just using Wix query. So the query result that was returned by the Velo API, Wix query, Wix data, so wixdata.query, and the query result that was returned by the SDK version had completely different structures. Okay, so it basically means that I completely do not believe, like I'm gonna assume out of the box that nothing in the SDK version is going to match what is in the Velo version. And if something matches, then I'll be happy. That's going to be my approach to this. So in many cases, the SDK version of a method works exactly the same as Velo version, and no further changes are necessary. Not true. I'm going to say it. However, in some cases, the SDK method might work slightly differently. This is especially true if you're using an older version of the Velo API. If there are any differences, you will need to address them in your code. This usually means that you need to pass different information when calling a method or handle the method's response differently. In some cases, this may mean calling a method from a different module than you are used to. Some common APIs that may be called differently when using the SDK are Elevate. This method is called from auth submodule of essentials module when using the SDK. Web method, this is called from the web method module when using the SDK. Fetch, you can use the native fetch by calling this method on the front end or back end without importing it when using the SDK. Interesting. So I guess in the Wix backend, you can just use fetch out of the box and you don't need to use Wix fetch. I guess. I want to put a huge asterisk on this and look into that. Get JSON, this method does not exist in the SDK. You can either continue to use the Velo version for now or convert your get JSON calls to fetch instead. I've actually never used get JSON, so shouldn't be a problem. To get the JSON data from fetch response, call the JSON method. That's what I usually do anyways personally, so yeah. Okay, so this seems to be everything. SDK about site development. Let's take a look at that. Transition to the SDK we looked at already. Let's see if I'm missing anything here. Let me just go back to the previous about Velo method only so let's try this one about Velo only APIs and the SDK. Oh, this is okay. This is the original. That's interesting that they link to this article from within itself. So interesting. Um, about events and service plugins and the SDK. Let's take a look at that. Wix is, okay, we didn't read this yet, so let's read this quickly. Same introduction. While most Velo backend event handlers and service plugins have SDK equivalents, the SDK versions of these methods don't currently work in the context of website development or app development within blocks because the SDK wasn't made for website development. If you need to use backend event handlers or service plugins, continue to use the Velo versions as described in the reference. Okay, let's just see here what we have inside about site development. Let's see. Okay, so they do address the $w. Oh, so this is what I said about the $w. So here, these are APIs that are imported from Velo modules, but it's not included in the in that list over here. So here, Velo only APIs doesn't include $w at the moment. And here in their explanation inside the SDK of things that are only Velo, then it is included. Again, you can go ahead and say, oh, it's just like a small editing error in the documentation. They didn't move it yet or something like that. But to launch such a big change like this in a half-baked way, I think is, yeah, not, I don't appreciate it. Okay. So let's take a look here. I think, should we read this or not? Yeah, I'm gonna read it. If you're bored, if you think you got the point, you can sign off now. But I think this stuff is important, so I'm going to read it. Developing websites on Wix offers a unique blend of flexibility, ease of use, and powerful features, just where we are now. So this is about site development within the SDK. Okay, within the SDK about site development. Which again, remember that this is a rather new thing because until now the SDK was for headless projects, for self-hosted apps, etc. So this article is probably quite new, and it's approaching how to do site development, so Wix website site development using the SDK. So this is not something This is something new. Wix, blah, blah, blah. Okay, marketing. Until now, custom code on Wix sites was written using Velo APIs. At this time, Wix is transitioning away. We read this already. The transition is a gradual process. We read this already. Okay, so we know all this stuff already. APIs that are not imported from Velo modules. The following APIs that are imported from Velo modules do not currently have an SDK equivalent. Therefore, if you need the functionality of these APIs, etc. So we read this already. APIs that work by file and method name conventions. This sounds new and confusing. The following APIs may have SDK counterparts, but the SDK versions don't work for site development and for app creation within blocks. Therefore, if you need the functionality of these APIs, you need to use them with their Velo file and method name conventions as described below. Backend event handlers. Handlers for backend events, such as when a booked service is canceled, place Velo backend handlers in backend event handlers in a backend events.js file using the naming convention described in the Velo reference. Basically what you're used to already. So here, no change from what you're used to in terms of Velo events, backend events. Service plugins. Plugins that allow you to inject custom code into existing flows, such as, okay, explanation about what service plugins are. Install service plugins in the editor, update the get config file in the methods config.js, and implement the main service plugin method.js file. Okay, so service plugins as we are familiar with. If you're not sure what service plugins are, I have some tutorials about those. Let's say the additional fees service plugin SPI or the validation service plugin SPI, etc. Data hooks, as I said. So I swear I did not read this in advance. Like the things I said earlier were purely out of just developer instinct, having used Wix for some time. And they're just going through exactly the things that they didn't. So that it's mentioned here in the SDK, but it's not properly separated or documented on the Velo side. Where somebody who this transition is important to is likely to end up first. So data hooks, hooks that run before or after data operations, such as updating an item. So this I mentioned earlier, place data hooks in the backend data.js file using the naming conventions described in the Velo. Okay, routers. For custom routers of incoming requests, router code, place router code in a backend routers.js file. So all like the special backend files, no change at the moment. So those still stay as they were. I'm just going to continue here. Example. Okay. This example demonstrates using SDK functionality alongside Velo APIs. Here we create a router using the Velo API by using method naming conventions and some methods imported from the Wix router module. The router retrieves data using the Wix data SDK package. Okay, so here we're importing from the SDK, and this is an import from Velo. Okay, and then here within the router itself, this is all happening in the routers.js file in your editor. And let's see over here. So essentially the whole setup of the router is done. So the return not found, okay, those are all imported from Wix router. And the query itself is done through a package, okay, through SDK module. Okay, so this is an example of a mix between the two. That is that. About site development, okay, this is also in the SDK. So this is what we just read. Okay, so I think that kind of wraps up the this saga, at least for the moment. I just felt urgently that I needed to share this with you because this is going to be significant. I wouldn't be surprised if within a week or two suddenly there's a beta that comes up here that they 2 steps forward, 1 step back in terms of how fast they want to move on this thing. I'm somewhere between surprised and disappointed that there wasn't any explanation as to why this transition is happening. I mean, that's you're putting developers through hell with this thing, and you don't take a moment to explain why. So I will try and do that for them based on what I've heard, because I believe that the intentions in the end of the day, there has to be some reason. There has to be some hopefully good intention here behind the transition. So one is unification. So at the moment, Wix has so many different references. So we have REST, we have SDK, we have Velo, and keeping those all updated and in line probably not only takes a toll on Wix itself, but just introduces more potential for inconsistency, okay, which already exists between the SDK and the Velo API that we're all going to suffer from initially, but hopefully down the line, once this whole unification process is complete, it will allow Wix to release APIs in a much more streamlined, unified, quick way. Okay, so it's like we're ripping off a Band-Aid very slowly. But once that's done, hopefully there will be a better future. It will also make potentially the world of application building more accessible to people who just develop on Wix websites because the packages, the SDK will be the same. So when you're going to develop an app for Wix, you're essentially going to be using the same things that you would use to develop within Wix. So it's really just a much more smooth transition versus, having people like myself who use Velo a lot to do things on Wix websites and occasionally develops apps mostly in blocks, and will need to learn this SDK. Now because I've been forced to, but if I wanted to develop an app, then there would have been a learning process here. But now, theoretically, in let's say 1 year's time, once the migration is complete and we're using the SDKs in websites, then transitioning from writing code on Wix websites to apps for Wix would be a seamless transition. So that's one thing. Another thing that was mentioned to me explicitly by Wix is having more control over your code, essentially. So the way that the Velo APIs work at the moment is that Wix sometimes takes APIs and makes them deprecated and releases new APIs, and sometimes even just makes changes within APIs without really telling you. So what this potentially would do, since it's moving to a package approach, which is something that's generally used in web development, theoretically, you should have the ability to control your package version. So for example, if I let me just show you here inside of the site itself. So here you can see that now currently what I have installed is Wix data v10198. Okay, and let's say Wix makes an update to Wix data and publishes an update to the package, so it'll be v1.1, let's say. Okay, so now I, as a developer, I have a choice, theoretically. I'll explain why I don't believe this 100% in a moment. But theoretically, I have a choice to not update the package if I want to, or not update it until I'm ready, let's say, to make that transition and make sure that, I've changed all my code appropriately and whatnot. So less chance of the rug being pulled out from under your feet in the sense of control over your code and updates and stuff like that. Why I am slightly skeptical about this claim, not that I'm skeptical that Wix really thinks that this could be a good thing, but why I don't think it'll really make a difference, is that in the end of the day, these modules, these packages are for interfacing with the Wix infrastructure. So the Wix data package is used for interfacing with CMS collections, with Wix databases. So if Wix were to make an update to how their databases function in a way that then requires the APIs to be changed as well, and then they release an updated package, even if I choose to keep using the older package, I don't see how the old code, the old APIs will interface with a fundamental change made to the structure of the data system. Okay, so there's going to be some kind of lack of compatibility there that will force me to update my packages anyways. That's what I think. Maybe it's due to my lack of completely understanding, how these things work behind the scenes or whatnot. But that's why I think that the first reason that I presented is probably, I hope, is the more fundamental reason that this is happening versus just like package updates and stuff like that, which I don't see personally to be as valuable. So that's that. This is all quite new. I didn't think it was going to be coming quite this fast, so I still need to think personally, like in terms of future tutorials that come out on the channel. Will we be using the SDK? Will we be using Velo APIs? Will we do a little bit of both until this all gets worked out? So definitely, this is definitely, if it's made your work harder as a developer, it's made my work 5 times harder. Because not only as a developer do I have to deal with this and my team have to deal with this, but I also have to deal with this when creating content for an audience in kind of like a shaky, volatile world. So that's fun, and I'm looking forward to that going forward the next few weeks. I think we're going to wrap up here. If you have any questions, comments, feelings about this transition, migration, please leave them in the comments below. I think this is a great opportunity for community discussion here surrounding what's happening. And if you don't want to miss out on any future updates like this or just general Wix tutorials and content, you can consider subscribing to the channel. And why not give this video a like because it probably gave you a heads up about something that would have been pretty frustrating to discover by yourself. So yeah, and if after you've done all that, I will see you again on Monday.